This is lecture week 5, and this lecture will be broken up into 3 parts. This is a discussion about poverty. We'll look at explanations for poverty. We'll look at how poverty is defined, and we'll also look at how poverty is measured. So let me give you a quick outline of what I intend to cover in this section. So in the first part of this lecture, I'll look at the theoretical explanations for poverty. We'll look at 4. In particular, there's certainly more than 4 different explanations, but we'll look at the 4 major ones. And then we'll get into the second part of this lecture where we start to define and explain how the Census Bureau, how they measure poverty. And so we'll look at their measurement method. We'll look at who's poor in the US, distinguishing between poverty rates and poverty composition. And then to give us a better sense for what those numbers mean, what those estimates mean, we'll look at poverty across time and across different national contexts. And that should give us a better feel for, more of an intuitive feel for what poverty looks like here in the US. And in the last part of this lecture, we'll take up a larger policy concern, and that's having to do with addressing both poverty and the issue of work effort simultaneously. We noted before that there's often a trade-off between the two. And so we'll revisit this conundrum between poverty and the work effort in the last section, and what the government tries to do to address both simultaneously, and the mechanism that's often used, which is an earnings disregard. But before we dive in, let me just talk through some of the major explanations for poverty. You should have read this in your Donito textbook, talking about why the poor are in fact poor. But most of the explanations typically center on individual level factors or structural level factors. And some of the explanations say that poverty is rooted in either the individual or some societal structure, or that they're sort of byproducts. They're sort of incidental byproducts of the individual or incidental byproducts of certain societal structures. So there's different dimensions by which these explanations are classified. And so talking first about individual level explanations. So one school of thought says that people are poor because of genetic differences. That is, the poor are genetically inferior. This is somewhat outmoded thinking, so we don't really think along those lines too much as scholars, but there is a small group of scholars who still make these types of arguments as recent as the 1980s. So the argument is basically that that race is connected to genetic differences in IQ, that it's really IQ that explains the differences in poverty that we see today. And so, like I said, we don't really lay much importance, but you'll note that these explanations are out there. And then the second group of explanations also center on individual level factors, but they say that poverty is not rooted in inherent characteristics per se, but that poverty is sort of a byproduct of a culture that individuals who are poor live in, that there's a certain value system or belief system that the poor, in other words, that they're lazy, that they're too present-oriented, that they don't know how to delay gratification, that they have low self-esteem, and so on and so forth. So that there's a culture of poverty. This is the culture of poverty thesis. And so some proponents of this theory will say that this sort of culture is transmitted from one generation to the next, that there's an intergenerational transmission of poverty. And then, of course, the more moderate versions will assert that that poverty, even within within this particular generation, that the poor are poor because they don't have the right role models to teach them the right values that are conducive to success in our society. And so if poverty is rooted in the culture, if it's rooted in these values, then naturally the solution to poverty is to address these values, to provide the right role models, and to change the culture of poverty that's inherent in society today. So there's 2 other explanations that center more on societal structures. There's one explanation which says that poverty is rooted in the institutions in our current society. So things like the economic structure, the political structure, namely the design and the structure of different programs that are available to the poor, that we've sort of fostered poverty in the programs that we operate. And then that poverty is rooted in other structures like our educational system and such. So the most popular explanation within the school of theory, within the school of thought, says that poverty is due to economic changes. That is, take a look at the 1960s when the manufacturing factories, when the manufacturing-centered jobs moved from the inner cities to the suburbs, and it left the inner city workers, the low-skilled workers, displaced. And so when the new service-type jobs became available in the inner cities, their skills didn't match the new jobs that became available. So the theory centers around this sort of mismatch, this sort of skills mismatch. And so the natural solution, if you think poverty is rooted in changes in the economic structure, well, you either provide more jobs that fit the skills that are fit the skills of the workers that are displaced, or you provide the low-skilled workers with the jobs that might match the new jobs that become available. So that's one line of thinking here. Another line of thinking within the school of thought is that the poor are poor because of our political structure, namely the existence and the generosity of our welfare system. And so the natural prescription, or the natural solution there, is to change our welfare system. And that's exactly what we did in the 1990s and 1996. As a result of these conservative arguments, we dismantled our welfare system and replaced it with our current welfare system. That's TANF. So that's the third set of explanations. And the last set of explanations centers on Marxist type thinking. So if you've ever taken a sociology class that looks at Marxist theory, you'll be familiar with this sort of reasoning. But basically, it says that people are poor because of the capitalist system. That poverty is rooted in the capitalist structure. Namely, Marx predicted that in a capitalist structure, you would end up with two classes, just two. You'd have those who own the means of production, the haves versus the have-nots, or more formally stated, the bourgeois versus the proletariat, and that the bourgeois would manipulate or exploit the poor to their advantage. And so the modern-day version might be to think about how corporations operate and their need to maximize profits, that those who own the means of production, the CEOs, the managers of these big companies, that they benefit from keeping wages as low as possible because it maximizes the company's profit margins. That's the sort of thinking that we engage in today. And so if you're within this camp and you think that poverty is rooted in in the capitalist structure, then naturally we have to do something about that capitalist structure. Realistically, we're probably not going to overthrow the capitalist structure, but you work within the capitalist structure to fight for workers' rights, maybe for stronger labor unions that can negotiate the hours worked and the wages of low-skilled workers. So that would be the prescription if you believe that poverty is, in fact, sort of in the Marxist realm of thinking. So in this next section, in part two, we'll get a little more technical in our discussion, and we'll give some definitions of poverty, more working definitions, and then we'll look at how poverty is measured by the Census Bureau.